And I'm thankful that we have a critical mass on 4th of July weekend. And thank you all for coming to be with us as we continue in this, I think our third year of tradition now, where we have done a Justice in July series during the Sunday School Hour, recognizing that many people are traveling, and this is, of course, a good opportunity for us to think on critical issues facing our community and also our country, and we have quite a few folks here this morning, so I wish to welcome you all. We are looking forward today to have Dr. Debbie Tribble with us presenting on public education and how to stand in solidarity with our educators and our schools, our public schools. And so I'm very grateful for that. I will give her a more formal introduction here in just a moment. But before I do that, I do want to make note that next week we will have Dr. Jeremy Williams with us via video. He will be leading a Bible study on the book of Acts, and particularly criminalization in the book of Acts. Dr. Williams is a professor at Bright Divinity School, professor of the New Testament, and is also the inaugural director for the Center for Justice and Theology at Bright. Someone who has a Harvard PhD and has come here to Fort Worth just about a year and a half ago and has put together a really incredible dissertation on criminalization in the book of Acts. And I'm not going to steal any of his thunder, but he is a very, very bright and, I didn't mean that, but insightful reader of Scripture. And I think that you will find what he has to say to be illuminating for the book of Acts and the world in which the early church was living. I will say that I will be gone next week on choir tour. And so this will be video streamed, and then we will also have a host here for some kind of interaction to follow the teaching. But I'm very grateful that we're all here this morning. As I said, we have a good little crowd here. And Debbie said she wasn't sure if she was going to have a critical enough mass of people, so she brought her own folks, which I think that's fantastic. I told her I'm going to do that on Sundays. So we're very, very grateful. I'm going to say a word of prayer and then give an introduction to Dr. Tribble, and then we will begin because we want to give her close to the full hour. Let us pray together. Gracious God, we ask now that you would come and open our minds to see what's going on, so that we can understand, as Karl Barth said, how to put the Bible next to the newspaper and to understand our times in which we are living. We know that these are challenging, momentous, disturbing, and even dangerous. And God, we ask that you would help us to find our place in all of this, to stand as we may as beacons of light and witness, and shine like stars in the universe, as the Scripture says, in a crooked and depraved world, that this is the time where our light can shine. Open our minds to learn from Dr. Tribble, and solidify us as a people with all of the educators and learners of this community and this country, we ask in Christ's name. Amen. Debbie Tribble has served as a public school educator for 35 years. God bless her. And in her last position in public education, she was the assistant superintendent of secondary education, secondary administration at Hurst Euless Bedford ISD a district serving 22,000 students. Dr. Tribble has also served as a high school principal, middle school principal, alternative school principal, and secondary school counselor, as well as director of curriculum and instruction in the Birdville School District, another 22,000 student district, of which we have fans this morning. She was named Region 11 Secondary Principal of the Year in 2002 and supervised 2 National Blue Ribbon junior high schools in 2011. Currently, Dr. Tribble is an associate professor at Dallas Baptist University and teaches public relations in the doctoral program in educational leadership. She holds a bachelor degree in English with a minor in public speaking from Texas Wesleyan University, and her master's degree from the University of North Texas is in school counseling with a minor in psychology, and her doctorate in education is in educational leadership with a minor in curriculum and instruction. Let me say all this also as she comes up. She's a member of this church and is a very strong champion for justice and for just people, humans, civil rights, all of those kinds of things. She hasn't been here long, but if you've gotten to know her in the last year, I think you feel the same way that I do in saying she's someone to contend with, and we're grateful for her very much, along with her husband-to-be, Rick. We're very, very grateful for both of you, and we welcome you, Debbie.
Thank you. Good morning. How many of you are either teaching currently, retired from teaching? You've been in public education? Wave at me. Awesome. All right. Yeah, my people. These are my people. I want to tell you a little bit about my story first. You may think that I am passionate about public education. Let me tell you, first of all, before I forget, if you have a child, grandchild who is in private education, God bless you. I love you. I have no issue at all if you're making sacrifices to send your children to private education. You and I'll talk later if you want the state to pay for that for you. But if for whatever reason you have made a choice and your child or grandchild is in private school, God bless you. And you and I are friends and we have no problem. You might think that I'm passionate about public ed because I've been in it so long, and truly I have been in it a long, long time. But that's not really what gave me the passion for public education. My mom and dad grew up in East Tennessee. Anybody know East Tennessee? My friend Daniel and Mike are on Norris Lake this morning, members of this church, and that's in East Tennessee. And they were both children of tobacco farmers, because that's cash crop in East Tennessee. And when they grew up and went to a one-room schoolhouse, 2 different one-room schoolhouses, at that time, when you were old enough to be of help on the farm, then you were expected to come home and be of help on the farm. And so somewhere around the 8th or 9th grade, both my mom and dad came home and went to work. And so neither of my parents graduated from high school. My dad, who was the youngest of 9 kids, decided of all of his siblings, he's the only one, the baby, and the only one of his siblings that decided, I'm not interested in farming. And so he had a friend who got him a job in Fort Worth, Texas, which he had never heard of up until the time he got the job, working at the Fort Worth Star-Telegram as a forklift driver. And he did that for 30 years and brought my sister and I to Fort Worth, and of course, after he and Mom got married, my mom was 17, and so he took her and crossed the Kentucky line because you couldn't get married in Tennessee under 18 without your parent permission. So, but in Kentucky you could. So they crossed over and went to work. My mom and dad could teach me a lot about hard work, and they did. They could teach me a lot about kind of a fundamental evangelical faith, and they did. And sometime later, I'll talk to you for another 50 minutes about that. But that's what Mom and Dad gave me. What they couldn't give me was talk about education. Other than my earliest memory is we have a hard time because we have no education, therefore you will have education and you will be wealthy. Well, they kind of messed up about that last part, but definitely they wanted me to treasure education. And as soon as I started going to school, y'all, I did. My teachers were everything to me. My teachers were just above the angels, and honestly changed my life in pretty much any way it could be changed. A teacher took me to the first concert I ever attended. A teacher took me to the first art gallery I ever went to. A teacher took me to the first restaurant, other than DQ, that I ever went to, a restaurant with cloth on the table, and they brought us fresh green salad with French dressing that I was certain had been flown in from Paris that morning. Teachers were everything to me. And teachers said things in an encouraging way to me that honestly changed my life. I can remember when I was in the 8th grade, I turned in an assignment, and my teacher looked over it really briefly, and then she looked at me and she said, "Debbie, I can't wait to see who you're going to be when you grow up." Okay, if life had a soundtrack, and it should, at that moment there would have been a trumpet fanfare and the light would have shone down from heaven. Because my teacher, who knew everything, said, you're going to be somebody when you grow up. I can't wait to see it. And that meant everything to me. Now, having said all that, I'll tell you that I was smart enough to figure out that teachers didn't make a fortune. And so my senior year, I loved my senior English teacher, and at the end of the year I said to her, "Miss Hudkins, I love you, and I love everything you've shared with us, but I don't know if you noticed this or not, but there's a lot of people in this room that don't really get you. They don't really get how wonderful this literature is and how wonderful this poetry is, and in many ways you pretty much are casting your pearl before swine." And then here's my grandiose statement. "And for that reason, I will never be a teacher." And my senior English teacher just kind of looked me up and down and said, "Debbie, you've got teacher written all over you. Good luck. Try to avoid it. I'll see you in 4 years." And that's exactly what happened. I tried to avoid it. I majored in biology. I went toward pre-med. And then all of a sudden one day I was in a invertebrate embryology class, when all of a sudden I realized I care not for either invertebrates or their embryos. What am I doing here? And changed my major and became a teacher. So that's where the first passion came from. people who changed my life. I'll tell you in a minute why I tell you that story. I became a teacher, and I was a baby teacher and didn't really know much. Did that change? No, there it goes. I didn't really know much about how school was financed, the politics of it, and later on, I found out that teaching is probably one of the most political jobs you can have. At least in Texas, I'm assuming everywhere, but I know for sure in Texas. Part of the Texas Constitution says that Texas must provide the majority of support for a free and public education. When I was a baby teacher, the state provided 61%, which is the majority of support for public education. When I left teaching, the state provided 38% of the cost of public education. All the rest of it coming out of property taxes. And so people would complain about their property taxes, and many legislators would say, well, we got to pay for those schools and those rich teachers. Those ones with the, 2002 Toyotas in the parking lot. And as a baby teacher, Mark White was the governor. And Mark White, and I realized that many of you weren't born in the room. Mark White really was our friend, but we didn't recognize it because he, in a deal with the legislature, made teachers take a competency test. And I can remember getting up on a Saturday morning. Okay, that's number one strike against him right there. I had to get up on a Saturday morning and go and take a teacher competency test. How many of you took that test on Saturday morning? Okay, a few of you. And if you remember, it was incredibly easy to the point of being insulting. And so on that morning, when everybody took the test, it was really easy. Poor Mark White. One time in my career, in 35 years, I have seen teachers vote with one voice, one time, and it was to tell Mark White he was no longer needed as governor in the state of Texas. So then I began my career in earnest. I have a question that I want to ask you, though, when we're talking about education. This is not a rhetorical question. I really want you to answer. How does a community benefit when its citizens are well educated? Yell at me loud. Democracy. Cindy Stormer said that, no surprise. And usually that's the last answer I get, usually. An educated person in the community is more likely to vote, more likely to participate as a citizen. Okay, so I want you to keep that in mind. A well-educated person is more likely to vote, which is really helpful if you live in a state where they want you to vote. What else, though, does a community get, Ronnie?
Well, we talk in principles of education about different things that have happened in the school system over the years, and every major civil movement started in the school before it made its way into law.
Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing? Every movement began in school. Y'all are thinking in such lofty terms, though, in a practical way. If you live in a community with educated people, what does that get you?
Starting at the very most basic level, having an educated population means that every job out there is filled by somebody who's capable and competent. They can read, they can do basic mathematics, all those things that people swore, I'm never going to do this after I leave school, why don't they need to do it? Well, having that education means that you can do it where you can seek out the person who will be more advanced knowledge. So, and we all benefit from being able
That's you attain skills. You attain skills that allow you to do what kinds of things? Yeah.
Thomas Jefferson wrote about the fact that everyone needed an education because it made his plantation more successful.
Okay. Shay?
It increases your own value.
Says my real estate agent. But it does. It does. If you want to see the value of your house go down, be in a community where people aren't educated. Yeah, that's the truth. Yes.
Teaches you how little you know.
That's true. Not really helpful for what we're doing at this moment, but it's true. Yes. Okay. These are the things that I listed. You clearly are much more intelligent than I am. Work skills, higher income, chance at equality, less crime. I'm talking about my kids now, and this is really true. I was a high school principal for a long time, and I asked to see the crime figures for my area. When those kids are in school, juvenile crime goes way down. When they get out of school, they have plenty of time to case my house, to case your house. They need to be the idle hands and the devil's workshop. That's really true for teenagers. And then usually one of the last things people think of is you're a better citizen. You're more likely to vote. You're more likely to participate in government. Okay. Private education. Education, up until this point, education is a multi-billion-dollar market. If the majority of kids in Texas were not educated in public school, and they are, there's a lot of money to be made in education. And conservatives just basically believe, this is part of their tenets, that things are better that happen in privatization than it is when it's governed by the government. Free market is always better. So as we begin to think about, okay, what's going on in school, and this table right here, I've worked with some of these people and loved some of these people. And in the past, some of them have said to me, Debbie, we think you're paranoid about what's happening to public school. And last month, Texas Monthly's cover article is the campaign to sabotage public schools. That's the lead article. So you're not paranoid if people really are out to get you. But I'm not naive about the media and biases that are built into the media. So let me tell you from my own personal experience what I've noticed throughout the years. If you want to make money off of schools, this I learned from being an assistant superintendent. Most school budgets, school district budgets, are 88% personnel. Like 88% personnel. Okay, before you think, well, those teachers are wealthy. It takes way more than a teacher to run a school district. You have to have teachers, you have to have bus drivers, you have to have people who mow the yard, you have to have lunch ladies, you have to have counselors, you have to have psychologists. There are a lot of people that are required to run a school district. And it makes up about 88% of the budget. The next biggest budget item is electricity, gas to fuel the buses. At your house, is electricity going up? Is gasoline going up? Maybe everywhere but Texas, but even in Texas, the cost of energy, and that's another 10%. Therefore, if you want to make money running schools, you either have to lower salaries of people working in schools, or you have to hire less people. And if you hire less people, if you hire less teachers, what does that mean? That means the classes get bigger and bigger.
Lowering the salaries, okay? That's why we had that in '80s, okay?
Uh-huh.
We had our police chief over all the school districts paying $245,000 a year, okay? And we kind of found that out, we kind of lowered the salaries. Good luck.
Well, in school districts, you can find out, in public school districts, public education, you can find out what everybody in the entire school district makes. It's completely transparent. It's online. Anytime I want to find out what the starting salary is in Crowley, not only for a teacher, but for anybody who works for Crowley, all I have to do is go online and I can find that out. It is completely transparent. Not so in other schools, but I'll get to that in just a second. So, Debbie's back in the classroom. In 1980, testing began. And I was there for tabs, teams, tacks, toss, star. I've tested every one of them. And I will honestly tell you that early on in testing, it really did improve things in schools. Up until that point, I'll give you an example. I can remember when I was in school, I grew up in Poly. That's where I lived. Any Poly people here? Yay, Poly people. I lived right across Berry from the Masonic home, Mighty Mites. And I went to Mitchell Boulevard Elementary School. And I remember during parts of the year, kids who were there to work the fields, usually Hispanic kids that were passing through, they would come to Mitchell Boulevard Elementary, and they weren't going to stay very long. And so when I was in school, we sent those kids down the hall to watch Disney movies in English. Like, I can remember that happening. I can also remember, again, I was in school when this happened, when dropouts were not a problem, they were the solution to a problem. And usually this was guys in high school, and the assistant principal would call them in and say, "Son, I think you've got all the education that you need. Don't let the door hit you on your way out." And usually that was a kid that was causing trouble, but those things really happened. When testing began in Texas, we no longer did norm reference tests, we did criterion reference tests, and every single kid mattered. Okay, that is an improvement. Every single kid mattered. And we had to be responsible for every single kid's scores. So at the beginning, all I saw was improvement in the testing. And then testing continued. And with every iteration of the tests, they got more and more difficult. There was more and more pressure put on schools. I can remember when the scores were released, that was a headline in the next morning's paper. Which schools had done well, which schools had not done well. There was a problem about that, though, because the way we calculated, we didn't, the way the legislature calculated scores, it wasn't that your overall school needed to have a 90% or above to pass. It was that every single subgroup had to have 90% or above to pass. Okay, what is the problem there? One of the subgroups is socioeconomic depressed kids, poor kids. So does that mean poor kids are automatically not as smart as rich kids? No. All my teachers in the room go, no, Debbie, no. And that's absolutely true. What they don't have, however, is the background knowledge of a wealthier kid. My granddaughter, who's 6 years old, her mother and father this summer took her to Austin to the Capitol to caution her about, no. They didn't caution her about anything. They took her to the Capitol, though, so she could experience Austin and what the Capitol looked like. Okay, this next year then in school, when the teacher says, what is the capital of Texas? My little baby is going to go, whoop, Austin. I went there this summer. However, if that kid had been me, and I didn't go further than 3 blocks from my house during the entirety of my childhood, I probably couldn't have gone Austin. So background knowledge, it shows up in school, but that's not all the knowledge that there is. And children who come from economically depressed backgrounds, be they white or of color, don't come to school with the same stuff that kids from a wealthier background come with. So all of a sudden, when the scores came out, guess which districts always scored at the very top? Districts without subgroups. If everybody in your school is rich and white, then you're gonna have a pretty easy time of doing well. So, and that was never pointed out to the public. The public didn't know how we got scores. All they knew was some of these, like, apparently, the teachers in Southlake must be like setting things on fire, because look how good their scores are. And Fort Worth ISD, holy cow, well, we better get some new teachers in there. When that had nothing to do with it at all. It had to do with the numerical quantities of each subgroup. I can remember calling, when I was a high school principal, I can remember calling my superintendent one morning and saying to him, this is in October, because October is the drop dead date for the kids that you're going to be responsible for their scores, even if they move off someplace else. If they're your kid in October, that's your kid. And I called my superintendent and I said, I just want to prepare you. We are not going to be an exemplary campus this year. And he said, well, Dr. Tribble, while I sympathize with you, my expectations have not changed. I expect you to be an exemplary campus in May. And I said, okay, well, let me explain this to you in another way. I have a subgroup, at least 25 kids, at the junior level who do not speak English. I am going to give them a test in April in a language they do not speak. Does that clarify things for you? Well, you would have to know him. He just would never let off. And he was like, and I finally said, I could take these kids home to live with me between now and April. If I dropped you in France today, could you take an exit level test in French in April? Because exit level did not have any They didn't have a Spanish version. At younger grades they did, but not at exit level. So then I begin to think, why is it that the state wants us to look bad? Well, in 2013, a book came out called Reign of Error. It was written by Diane Ravitch, who was the Assistant Secretary of Education under George H.W. Bush. And at the beginning of the testing, she had been a proponent. She had helped push it. But then as things began to change in testing, she recognized, wait a minute, there's another agenda happening here that I never signed up for. And that is, if we can make the schools look bad, we can get our parents to take kids different places than public education. She also talked about all the different ways that media made school districts look bad. And that doesn't take very much intelligence, just because you know how the media is today. If it bleeds, it leads. And there's not much press time for anything else, good things that are happening. Okay, when I read the Ravitch book, this is in 2013, I was like, wow, people have to know this. People have to know there's an agenda behind this testing. And if you notice, it's a pretty big book with little print. And most teachers are working all the time, and they didn't have time to read that. So I decided, okay, I'm going to write a book. And this is the book I wrote. It's big and colorful and has exactly 20 pages in it. And I thought, okay, well, teachers will read a short book, and it said the same thing, that a really good teacher can have not wonderful scores if she primarily is teaching children from impoverished backgrounds. I hoped that this would revolutionize education. The fact that none of you have ever heard of it pretty much tells you what you need to know. Though I did partner up with a gentleman that many of you know. His name is Charlie Johnson. He currently is the interim pastor at Second Baptist Church in Lubbock, and was a big influence on Ryan. I'm not sure if that was positive or negative, but if you talk to Charlie, it was all positive. Anyway, I partnered up with him and his organization that he had just begun called Pastors for School Kids, and Charlie raised the money to send a copy of this book to every one of our legislators, who were all Republican and didn't care. Because, again, I've already told you about the plank. They believe that private can do better than public. Okay, so I'm in the classroom, time goes on. Now I became a counselor first, because I wanted to be able to help kids and their families. I'm a terrible counselor. I want to confess that to all of you. I'm not a good counselor. I can listen to you tell me sad things for about 3 hours, 3 different sessions, and at that point I'm going to say, and so do you understand that if you keep doing things like that, you're going to get the same result? That's not good counseling, y'all. Good counseling is where you let the client discover, and I just didn't have the patience for that. It makes for a good administrator, though, because I can make decisions. Like a teacher would come to the door and say, I need a decision about this, and start tapping her foot. And I can come up with solutions, which may be right or may not be right, but I can come up with them really fast. So first I became a counselor, then I became an administrator. In 1993, there was such inequity in school districts across the state that, and I remember this precisely, Highland Park was planning to build a planetarium for their school district. If you know Highland Park, it's a very property-rich district, a lot of money. At the same time, school districts in South Texas were putting buckets out when it rained because they couldn't replace their roof. They couldn't afford advanced placement classes because there's some money involved with that. Vast inequities. And so the state came up with a solution that they commonly called Robin Hood, where once you had your property taxes equaled your allotment, you had to send the leftover to the state, who could distribute it to districts with lower property taxes or equity, property equity. And at the time, there was a lot of pushback, especially from wealthier school districts. And it sounded something like this: hey, I've worked hard to be able to afford to live in Highland Park. And I'm sorry about those kids in South Texas, but if we can afford a planetarium, I want my kids to have a planetarium. Well, as an educator, I have one non-negotiable principle. I have one thing that they ask, the hill you will die on. This is the hill I would die on. Every single kid deserves a quality education. Every single kid. And it doesn't matter that, wow, thank you. I've never received applause by that, for that. Part of that comes from my upbringing. I told you I grew up in Poly. In Fort Worth, that's the wrong side of the track. I didn't know anybody who had a swimming pool in their backyard. I swam at Berry Pool. I especially didn't know anybody who drove their own car to school. So partly it's because of that. And partly it's just because every kid deserves to be able to dream and then have the skills to achieve that dream. You can't achieve what you can't dream. So initially, I was like, okay, well, I'm sad, I wish you felt like I felt, but every kid gets a quality education. And so Robin Hood is okay. Robin Hood has been in place now for 30 years. And over the course of 30 years, property taxes have gone up everywhere. Initially, there was only a couple of dozen school districts that had to send money to the state. Now there are hundreds of school districts that have to send money to the state. If the money is distributed and everybody has the allotment, so is the state then nice enough to send the extra money back to the school district? No. Once that money goes, you never see it again. And at the last count, it was $35 million, because that was what we could have spent on education during the last legislative session. This legislative session, we're expected that $3 billion could travel to the state. That school districts have sent, a lot of school districts now, to make sure that there is more equity. And there's still not real equity across Texas. In 1995, to move toward the privatization movement, Texas okayed charter schools which are publicly funded schools in Texas. Charter schools are not exactly like public schools, and to be really honest, there is a continuum of charter schools, some very good, some very bad, depending on how they're run. But there are some basic things that make them different. Number one, there is no transparency. In the school district where I live, I have a vote in who sits on my school board. And I can look up anytime what everybody in the district makes. If I were a charter school principal, I would get to pick my board. Okay, let me say that again. I would get to pick my board. My board would look like this table right here. And when it came time for my salary to be negotiated, I would say, guys, I've worked hard this year, and I really think I deserve $250,000. Don't y'all agree? And because these are all my friends, they're going to go, yeah, you have been working hard. There's been a lot of sweat equity, Tribble. Yeah. And that wouldn't be public knowledge, and voters would have no say. Also in charter schools, there's no transportation to provide a way for kids to get to go to school. They don't have to provide nurses. They don't have to provide psychologists. In fact, if they need a psychologist, it's okay for them to come over to the public school, the traditional public school, and use our psychologists. And again, I don't get mopey about that. That's a kid. And if a kid needs a psychologist, I want them to have one. Typically, they have lower salaries because the teachers do not have to be certified. They don't have to go to school and learn how to be a teacher. They have a short class in the summer, and then they follow up with them the following year. So it's very different. In recruiting for the graduate program at DBU, I visit lots of schools. And when charters first came out, I went to a large charter with a beautiful, beautiful building with big columns in the front. Y'all know which one I'm talking about? And they're all over Tarrant County. But I went in that school, and a sweet little teacher said, "Can you help me get certified?" And I said, "Absolutely, that's why I'm here. What was your major in college?" "Home economics." There's nothing wrong with that. Rick wishes I had home economics. Her major was home economics. And I said, "Well, so what is your job here?" "I'm the chair of the math department." So charters are different. All right, I've already talked about Texas as far as its funding of schools. Texas funds schools in the bottom 5 of the nation. Texas, which is arguably one of the wealthiest schools in the country. Wealthiest states in the country. The per pupil expenditure has not changed in 5 years. Though, has your grocery bill changed in 5 years? Your gasoline cost, inflation has been at 19%, and we still fund schools at the same amount as we did in 2019. Retired teachers, okay, raise your hand one more time if you're a retired teacher. The last time, up until this legislative session, the last time retired teachers got a cost of living adjustment was 20 years ago. 20 years ago. Think of your favorite teacher and imagine her living on a 20-year-old salary. That pretty much lets people know what the legislature thinks of teachers. This year, the big thing was vouchers. Vouchers are not new. Vouchers were first proposed in 1954 when Brown versus Board decided that separate was inherently inequitable and that schools should be integrated. And at that time, Alan Shivers, who was the governor of Texas, said, "Oh, there's got to be a way around this, y'all. Let's come up with an idea where if you put your kid in a private school, the state money follows them. And we'll call it savings accounts for children, we'll call it scholarships, or we can call it vouchers." Now, it didn't happen in 1954, but that's how old it is. And that's the reason it was invented, as a workaround to make sure that schools stayed segregated. In my humble opinion, vouchers are thinly veiled bigotry. The vouchers are happening in other states. Arizona is having trouble now paying for schools across the board because they have vouchers. In Florida, the majority of kids using vouchers are wealthy, and their parents were already paying private school tuition. So then what they got was a discount when vouchers passed. In Michigan, where Betsy DeVos, who used to be under Trump, used to be our Secretary of Education, her legislature has just asked that the vouchers, private schools be, first of all, nonprofit, because the profit they were making was going out of sight, and that they be transparent, because education money was paying for things like jet skis and tickets to Disneyland and crazy things that a traditional public school would never put in place. Okay, that's where we are. And this last legislative session, despite 6 times trying to push vouchers down the throat of legislators, we were saved, not by Democrats, but by small district representatives. Because in Fort Worth, there may be a choice of private education ranging from $15,000 a year on the low end to $35,000 on the high end. So if you get a voucher for your child and you want to take them over to Country Day, you're still going to have to come up with $27,000, because the voucher at most is going to be $8,000, which, by the way, is $2,000 over what currently is spent on school kids. Why does Texas want vouchers? I think there's one reason. I've already talked about that. Why should they consider vouchers? Well, in December, our governor received the single largest donation in Texas history, which was $6 million from a gentleman named Jeff Yost, who is a national proponent of vouchers. Within Texas, there are 3 guys who are billionaires. In West Texas, Tim Dunn, Ferris Wilks, and his brother Dan Wilks, they are ardent believers in Christian nationalism. They believe that all schools should be private Christian schools, and had a conversation with Robert Strauss when he was in the House that God had not placed him there because he was Jewish, and that he should not be a leader in the House of Representatives. They are making huge donations to every legislator in Texas. And the man who manages their money met earlier this year for 7 hours with Nick Fuentes, who probably is best known as a white supremacist. Why are we pushing for vouchers? Because there's a lot of money going to legislators who say that's what we need. And as far as I can tell, the only reason that vouchers are being pushed is because of ambition and a thirst for power. I told you it was important that you know why I was passionate about public ed. If there had been vouchers when I was a kid, my mother and daddy would not have had the knowledge to be able to pick a school, and probably would have gone for the cheapest voucher they could so they could keep whatever money was left over, because they just needed it. They just needed it. I would not have been among the privileged few. I love, and I'm going to end with this, I love what Tom Brokaw said. There is a place in America to take a stand. It's public education. Public education makes us who we are. It gives every single kid the ability to shoot for their dream. Public education is the engine that moves us as a society toward a common destiny. It's in public education that the American dream begins to take shape. So as you think about voting and supporting public education, vouchers are being pushed because they come with a lot of money behind them to satisfy the ambition of a few men. And I'm probably women, but satisfy the ambitions. It does not improve the educational level, and it takes away from the dreams of kids that don't have economic disadvantages. Every single child deserves a quality education in Texas, and that's the hill I die on. And I want you to think about the kids that deserve a shot. We're not asking, they deserve a shot. One quick kid that I have to tell you about, a kid that when I was in HEB, he was born in the United States, but his father was deported because he was here illegally, and he was raised by his mother. That kid, despite every disadvantage, was a National Merit Scholar in HEB, which means he's in the top 1% of the nation. Started out speaking Spanish. Because he was a National Merit Scholar, he had his choice of free universities, went to Stanford, made it as pre-med, and while he was at Stanford, taught the janitorial staff how to speak English. Every kid deserves a shot. I so appreciate you listening to me today. Thank you so much. Thank you, darling.
Stick around for questions.
Sure. Absolutely, here.
Debbie, thank you so very much. I want to make sure everyone gets the title of your book. Mrs. Beach Loved to Teach is the title of the book. Well, let's make that a bestseller right now. And I'll just let you know, I think that Debbie will be here a little bit longer to answer field questions individually. We recognize that the streaming ends here at 10:30. Again, next week we will have Dr. Jeremy Williams with us from the Center at Bright Divinity School, the Center for Theology and Justice. We're very much looking forward to that, and I hope you will all be back. Yeah, well, why don't you want to introduce your friends?
Yeah.
Well, I don't recall all of the names, but a good group of people from Bangladesh who are here among us, and also Canada.
And Canada. And Deborah Harvey, there are 4 people that I spent the weekend with last weekend.
Why don't you use this?
Okay, there are 4 people I spent